It's wonderful to see all of you here, reconnect with old friends and meet new ones. Welcome to El Colegio de México. We're very happy to have you here. We're thrilled to have the very first conference of the Latin American and Caribbean chapter of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality. A big thank you to ECINEQ and Nora Lustig, the president of ECINEQ. Thank you very much for making this possible. This event wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of many sponsors. The World Bank with Luis Felipe López Calva, UNDP, Almudena Fernández, Praem Colmex, thanks Laura Juárez, and of course Centro Estudios Espinosa Iglesias with Roberto Vélez. We deeply appreciate your contributions and commitment to this event. I also want to acknowledge the incredible team at Colmex who made this conference happen. Please say thank you to all of them, the Vinculación Office, Elizabeth and Adriana, Eventos, Sarah and her amazing team, Computing, Canek and his team, and of course our staff at the center, Leilani, Jacqueline, Dira, and Marta. Thank you to all of you. So we hope you have a fantastic time over the next couple of days, learning, networking, brainstorming new ideas for research, and hopefully making some new friends. Of course, if you enjoyed your time here, which I'm sure you will, please spread the word about El Colegio. We are a very small institution specializing in social sciences, so please spread the word about El Colegio. Now, let's go back to business. Thank you, Branko, for being here. It's an honor that you kick off this conference with your talk. Branko is a professor at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York, and he's one of the world's leading experts on inequality. His two latest books are Capitalism Alone in 2019 and Visions of Inequality in 2023. Both books are highly influential works in the field. Thank you very much. So we are delighted to have him here with us today. Let's give him a warm welcome and thank you. And let's have around 35 minutes and then I'll let you know so we can have some questions at the end. So thank you, Branko. Well, go ahead.
Es un placer de estar Ciudad de México. Es un placer de ver que la primera conferencia regional de ECINEQ es en Latinoamérica. Pienso que no es una sorpresa porque el trabajo sobre la desigualdad fue todo el tiempo muy avanzado en América Latina. But I have to say that actually I remember I was at the original conference in Palma de Mallorca in 2005, and it was a relatively small affair compared to what became later. Tony Atkinson became the first president, and there was also issue, it would seem strange now, but there was an issue with the name, because if you can notice, this name is pronounced wrongly. It should be, ECINEQ, but ECINEQ sounded very much economic cynic. So the issue was how are we going to pronounce that, and then we decided that we should pronounce a C as a K so that it became ECINEQ. So I'm very happy that the first regional ECINEQ is in LAC. So let me go on my presentation. My presentation, as Eduardo said, would be for about 30 to 35 minutes. It is, some of you have already seen parts of it because this is a presentation about global inequality with an ending which actually would deal with Latin America in the global context. I think it would be interesting to discuss and to open the discussion on the role, or actually, ironically, absence of a great role of Latin America in global inequality. So let me start with some historical things. This is the best that we can currently do to sort of have an estimate of how was inequality between individuals over the last 2 centuries. Now, the blue line is based, the underlying numbers are GDP per capita from medicine data, and this is actually updated compared to the original work that was done by François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson. Now, the distributions are still theirs. So what is happening there, you have the means, which are GDP per capita, and I impose the distribution that basically Christian kind of developed somewhat out of thin air. And I think this is where one of the next frontiers, where again Latin America is ahead because there are lots of work done, and you know that much better, so I will not even cite the names, but work done on social tables on 19th century Latin America. So we really have to fill this 19th century inequality with European countries, African, of course that was a big missing part, China, India, and so forth. So what is very clear, and I will not repeat that because it is quite well known, is that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, global inequality was, as you can see, about 50 Gini points. Throughout the 19th century, it went up, and it went up in that first era of rising inequality, essentially because the Western countries, what became the West afterwards, became much richer, and India and China stagnated, or even in the case of China, they went down. So that's why we had this very large increase in inequality throughout 19th century all the way to World War I, and then stabilization at very high level. Now, that was the second era, if you will. That was the era of the second part of the 20th century, with very high inequality of the Gini, calculated always in PPP terms, and always on an individual basis. And then the red dots are now based on household surveys. In some cases, household surveys slightly adjusted for the underestimation on the top. And there, of course, we have much better data. And we enter the third era of global inequality, which is essentially rise of China and rise of Asia. So that, of course, is going to play quite a big role in the most recent developments. And as you can see, actually, the decline of global inequality is quite significant. We are really talking about more than 10 Gini points decrease over the last 20 to 25 years. China is the main part of the story, but we should not forget extremely important and getting more important role of India, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, all the countries that had higher growth rates than the rich countries. So when you divide that, and I will go quickly over this graph, but when you divide the 3 eras and you look at what is behind each of them, and you say, okay, as you can divide, you can decompose, as you know, either tail or Gini into the between and within components. What was interesting when you contrast the first and the third era is the following. In the first era of the 19th century that I talked about, the drivers of global inequality were twofold. Between country inequality really increased, and also within countries, inequality went up. So that's why I called it was the age of colonialism and class struggle. Nowadays, the situation is different. You have the between component, which is really driving the decline in global inequality. So this is basically a convergence between countries, but through people. In other words, because the countries that have actually grown very fast and that used to be poor, like China, India, Indonesia, and so forth, are actually through the convergence mechanism or the between country inequality weighted by population, reducing global inequality. But the second component of within national inequality, as we all know, has gone up in the last 40 years. Not all the countries, and of course Latin America is an exception there, but broadly speaking for major countries, it has gone up. So we have in the current episode, in the current era, we have the two forces working differently. The between country inequality pushes inequality down, global inequality down. Within country inequality is offsetting to some extent that force. And that's why the decomposition is I didn't actually, that's why the red, I'm sorry, I should have defined that. The red line is the importance of the within country inequality. The blue, not the line, the blue bar is the importance of between country inequality. And that's why in the present era, you have the red bar increasing because of within country inequality is going up. And of course, the blue bar being shrunk significantly because of the effect of Asian growth. That also means that for the first time, if you look at this graph 2018, actually I have some data for 2023, but they are not complete yet. But in 2018, for the first time, you see the global income distribution on this slide. You see the shape is now getting somewhat closer to log normal. And that's quite interesting, and it's quite different from how it was only 30 years ago. If you look at 1988, what Danny Kwok called the twin peaks of the world were still in existence. You had an extremely high mode of income distribution at very low levels of income, essentially Asian countries and Africa, and then you had another small mode, which was really rich countries. Well, that has really disappeared. Of course, mind you, this is obviously all in log terms, and the right tail is still very much, much longer than obviously left tail. So the distribution is not symmetrical even in log normal terms, but it is becoming more symmetrical, and it looks more like a distribution of a single country. That's kind of bizarre, but with still the Gini of 60, you see actually a log normal distribution, which means that, of course, the part in the middle has become much thicker than in the past. I don't like to call it the global middle class, because in Western countries, the middle class idea implies much higher level of income than we are talking here. We are talking about the middle class, which has in PPP terms of 2011 under $10 per day. So it's not the middle class in the Western sense, but it is the median class, if you want to call it like that. And of course, here is simply the change now seen through annual change, where you actually use GDP per capita simply to point out that you can actually, the underlying force of that is the convergence of population-weighted mean incomes. Even when you take China out, you still have that. But at the time of COVID, and to some extent due to COVID, but actually due to another effect, you actually for the first time see that population weight really changes in growth rates, which are kind of unusual. India having minus 10% growth in 2020. The problem is the end of the quasi-automatic China effect. In other words, China has become sufficiently rich. The median Chinese is now having an income higher than the median world citizen. Median person in the urban China is over the 70th percentile globally. So Chinese growth is no longer reducing global inequality. That's the key message. So if you want to reduce global inequality, you have to find a new engine, because China is now quasi-neutral. I'll have a graph, maybe I will have the time, maybe not to show it, but you can see it in the presentation. It's quasi-neutral and even on balance, adding to global inequality, China's growth. So that actually leads us to wonder if Chinese growth is now inequality increasing marginally, but still, are we now at the end of that third era of declining global inequality, or are other engines, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or especially important Africa, going to take the role of China? So that's basically the point in, I think, history that we find ourselves now. I here illustrate the rise of Asia, which I think is extremely important historical development of equal importance like the Industrial Revolution. And I just do it here in total GDP, just to give you an idea. Of course, it's well known that China has overtaken the US by the total GDP in 2015. But what is not as well known, for example, is the fact that India, if you take the Indian total GDP and compare with the UK, as recently as 1980s, the two GDPs were the same. India currently has a GDP which is 4 times as larger than the UK. Indonesia has a GDP which is 4 times as large as the Netherlands. And they were about the same, again, 40 years ago. So we are really seeing a fundamental change in the underlying global income distribution, which then gets translated also in geopolitical terms, which we of course know the competition between the US and China, but gets translated also into the personal incomes, individual incomes that we observe in household surveys. So that change happens at all points of the distribution. And I will be very brief on that because I want to show you what happens in the middle, which is the most interesting. At the bottom, what happens is that China has essentially sort of pulled out all of its rural population out of bottom 20% of the world income distribution. So that bottom of the world income distribution is now much more composed than in the past of people who fell into it because China pulled out, and that's India, Indian subcontinent, and Africa. Now, the interesting part, is particularly for, I think, for everybody, is what happens in the middle of the income distribution. Now, the graph on the left is position of the urban Chinese deciles in 1988 and 2018. It's no surprise that, of course, they have gone up. So if you take the 5th urban decile, they were around, I think, about 45th percentile globally. By the way, the vertical axis show you global position in your percentile, and the horizontal axis shows you the decile of the Chinese, or in this case Italian later, income distribution from 1 to 10. So the upper shift, the blue line becoming red line, shows you the advancement of the Chinese urban population in global income distribution. As you can see, they actually jump 20 percentiles above their position in 1988. 20 percentiles means that they actually they got ahead of something like 1.5 billion people at each individual position. Now, that sounds very good. Okay, so they have really gone up in the rankings. But if somebody goes up in the rankings, somebody has to go down in the rankings because the rankings are ordinal. Look at Italy, and Italy is an extreme example because the same story would be told for Germany, US, or any developed country. The bottom part of the Italian income distribution, these are the deciles 1, 3, and 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 4, I believe, went down significantly because Italy didn't grow in 25 years, and they actually went down in the global income rankings. So that's why you see this red line for Italy below the blue line. For the top of the income distribution in Italy, it didn't make any difference because the China effect is not yet felt at that high level. And that story, as I said before, is the same for Germany, is the same for other countries like here is the South Korea. The story is the same for the US, except that the declines at the bottom are not as dramatic as in Italy. That's why I took Italy, because I wanted to show you really dramatic declines in the position of the poorest Italian deciles. That doesn't mean that the poorest Italian deciles did not have growth. Actually, they actually had very minimal, but they had real growth. But the point is that real growth was not sufficient to maintain their position in the global income ranking. And what is also interesting here, I will skip Poland, which is also a very interesting case because they had very high growth rate, and still the bottom income distribution of Poland could not maintain its global position. But look at Brazil or Mexico, the story is really the same. In Latin America, the red line is below the blue in the middle of the income distribution. because that's where the China effect is felt. The China effect in Brazil is not felt at the bottom, because Brazilian bottom was among the poorest in the world before China and after China. So it doesn't really matter. They are there at the bottom. And the Brazilian top was also unaffected by the China effect, by the China's growth, because they were rich there, and the China's effect does not yet come to the very top of the income distribution. But as you can see, Brazilian middle went all down. The blue line became the red line, so they lost about, cannot tell exactly, but about maybe 4, 5, 7 percentage points in the ranking. So this is what I call the greatest reshuffle of the income distribution of the world since the Industrial Revolution. So we are really witnessing an incredible change where for the first time in 200 years, the top of the global income distribution, the top 2 deciles, are no longer composed only of people from the Western countries and Japan. I know that there were, of course, individual people from the rest of the world who were part of that, but they were not there in sufficient quantities to be really noticed. Now, the very top of the income distribution still globally, every global top, is still heavily populated by Western countries, and especially the United States, which has actually 40% of the people in the global 5% are American. Because America has a very specific feature of being a large country with more than 330 million people, of being very rich and being very unequal. So these 3 elements put lots of Americans at the top of the income distribution. But even for the US, as I was saying before, the China effect is felt at the bottom decile of the US income distribution. Now, the present situation, I will go very quickly over that, is very unique, and it makes it very difficult to make further forecasts as to what will happen. First, we had the COVID shock that I'm not going to read this, you can read it. That first COVID shock was really an important shock in terms of effects on within national inequalities and on global inequality because of the variation in growth rates of the countries due to the shock. Some countries did quite well, other countries really, like I mentioned, India in 2020 did very poorly. The second shock, which is really hugely important, is the shock between of competition and rivalry and, how should I call it, conflict between China and the US. And that, of course, I think going to play out for the decades to come with the effects on growth rate or income distribution of the 2 largest economies in the world, which together represent more than 40% of the global GDP. We never had that in the past, that the 2 largest economies, which actually account for almost half of the global GDP, are in de facto trade war. That didn't happen. If you look actually for the period after the World War II, first the US dominance was extremely strong in the 50s and the 60s. Then the second largest economy became USSR during one period, but they were basically unlinked economies. And then very briefly, Japan was number 2, and I think less than 10 years. And then, of course, China became number 2, and afterwards China became number 1. And then, of course, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, which further complicate the situation. So in that sense, we are in a very difficult position to say what will happen in the future. The thing that we can, other than the fact that this is unpredictable because of the wars and the conflict, one thing which is, I think, longer term is that point that I mentioned about the absence of China's inequality reducing effect anymore, which, as I said before, leaves 2 possible sources of global income inequality reduction. And they are Africa and basically subcontinent of Indian subcontinent. Now, this is really a cool graph, but just wanted to point out this is the marginal China effect. From 1979, when this graph is below 0, this is the Chinese contribution to the reduction of global inequality. And you notice that contribution becomes smaller and smaller as we come to the present, because of the fact that I was saying before, that China becoming too rich to be an automatic inequality reducer. And you notice in the last 2 years, this is based on GDP, this is not based on surveys, China becomes a contributor. So I would expect in 2023, where my new survey data will be available, that China would be a net contributor, small net contributor to global income inequality. So we really cannot rely on China effect, which then says, okay, let me see what can we rely on Africa then? And the story there, and that's why Africa now comes to center stage. First, it's a continent that failed to converge at all. Actually, of all the continents in the last 50 years, when you look at per capita growth rate, Africa is the bottom. Actually, with growth rate below 1% per person annually. It's a continent which did not, as you can see on this graph, did not generate any sustained growth in individual countries. If you look at at the episodes of 5 years growth per capita, or 5% growth per capita income for 5 years, you actually find almost no episodes in Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, at the recovery, during the recovery from the civil war, and Côte d'Ivoire, and the small countries which really basically depend on oil, or even Côte d'Ivoire, which depends on cocoa. And when you compare that, what happened to Asia, it's like a totally different story. I will not go through all the countries that had these episodes of 5 years by 5%. Obviously, that's arbitrary, but if you were to impose like 7 years or 7%, you would find even fewer, obviously. And basically what you have relatively small number of such episodes in Africa compared to a large number in Asia. You have only what is the number here? 1.6% of the time in Africa that you had such episodes versus almost 9% in Asia. So are we going to be optimistic for Africa's convergence? The history does not tell us that we can be optimistic. Further, Africa is the continent with large increase in population, the only one in the world, which would require, if you actually have this objective of 5% times 5 years, would really require growth rate overall of the overall economy of 7 to 8%, because you have to include 2% approximately of the population. So I think we may be at the end of the period that we actually, the third period with very strong decrease in global inequality. That's the pessimistic view, but maybe we would be surprised by African development in the way that many people, including Merdal, were surprised by the Asian developments, which they didn't expect in the 1960s, but in the 70s it started really exploding in some sense, mostly thanks to China. So do I have 5 minutes? My last point is because of this conference, what happened to Latin America? Have you noticed that so far I did not mention Latin America once? And this is my normal spiel, and really Latin America is a very peculiar continent, because when you have this global development over 200 years, Latin America is not mentioned. And I was actually asked that and started thinking, why it's not mentioned? Because it really, globally speaking, it has a significant population. We're talking under 10%, 8% of the global population. But it essentially moves with the world. It remains highly unequal within itself, within countries. I'll come to that in a moment. But its growth rate neither explodes like Asia, nor is it a very rich part of the world with which we measure Asia's success, nor is it Africa, which is not converging. So with a simple narrative of last 200 years, Latin America sort of disappears in this narrative, globally speaking. But of course, and indeed, when you look at the Gini coefficients and simply say, okay, let's take 25 or Latin American countries, compare that with individual countries in Africa, in Asia. As you can see here, the average, this is simply the average Gini coefficient is 46 in Latin America, and it's really higher than anywhere else in the world. But it is a different picture if you take the entire region-wide Gini of Latin America. And Latin American Gini, as you can see here, is lower than African and Asian Gini. And it's lower because the gaps in between country incomes in Latin America are much smaller. Asia is a continent with huge gaps between the countries, and what happens in Latin America and the Caribbean is that the mean country incomes are much closer to each other, and consequently they make the overall inequality between the citizens, all corrected for PPP, the usual stuff that I do for the world is now done also here for Latin America or for Asia or for Europe. And then you notice actually that level of inequality is the Gini of about 50, with within component being more significant than the between component, which is the opposite of Asia. So you can say, well, Latin America as a continent is not so unequal. The countries individually are unequal, but as a continent, it is not as unequal as I mentioned, as you can see here, as Asia and Africa. And then you can do the following thing. This is based not on surveys, now this is GDP per capita, and look at convergence where each country comes as a unit, in other words, what they call the concept one inequality. This is the Gini coefficient of GDPs per capita of either the world or Latin America over the years, over whatever, 60, 70 years there. And what you notice for the world, there is really an absence of the unconditional convergence. You see that number now expressed as a Gini coefficient is more or less stable, slightly declining in the last 20 years. And it's generally stable in Latin America, although at a much lower level than the world. So that's what I was saying before. Countries themselves are not so different. But what is interesting is when you do population-weighted thing, now it's also GDP per capita, but population-weighted, in PPP terms again. Of course, for the world, we know that it started going down from like 78, 1980, and you notice that number on the red line going down. But even Latin America shows a convergence of the population-weighted GDPs per capita. So there is no convergence of what you call unconditional convergence, but population-weighted convergence does exist. So then you put all of these things together, and you have the following situation. This is this is all for Latin America. You have more or less stable inequality in GDPs per capita of the countries. So this is, as we said before, this is unconditional convergence, where obviously you don't adjust by anything else, by other things on the right-hand side of the equation. You simply take GDP per capita and calculate Ginis of that. But the population weighted, the same international inequality in Latin America has gone down. So meaning essentially that countries with larger population have actually grown on a per capita basis somewhat faster than countries, smaller countries with small population. And that has produced the following effect. This is now interpersonal inequality from household surveys that I was mentioning before, sometimes adjusted for the top, over the last 30 plus years, including 2023, where actually the data for Latin America are pretty complete. And what you notice here, you have actually a decline in interpersonal inequality in Latin America. And that decline is not small, it's up to 9 to 10 Gini points in the last 20 years. And it's really the result of two developments. Is the first one, that population-weighted inequality of mean incomes in GDP per capita or incomes from household service has gone down, and then within national inequalities have shrunk. So there are two elements which have driven, this is my last slide, which were driven the interpersonal inequality in Latin America taken as a continent down, and that was, as I said, not a small decrease of 9 Gini points. I think, broadly speaking, that population-weighted inequality of mean incomes accounts for maybe 2 or 3 of these Gini points. I did very rough calculation yesterday, and that 4 or 5 Gini points are accounted by the reduction of within national inequalities. Now, if you question that reduction, because of course there are quite a lot of literature that questions the reduction on the top, maybe that 9 points is an overestimate, but probably you would end up with something like 7 Gini points reduction in inequality of Latin American and Caribbean citizens, regardless of the country where they live. And that, of course, is I think that positive note of what happened in the last 20 to 30 years. So I would finish on a sort of a positive note, and not an unusual one, because of course Latin America having been associated with high inequality, people tend to believe that it has to stay like that forever, but it does not. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Branko. Thank you for that talk. Excellent talk. So we have some minutes for questions. So just raise your hands and the mic will go there.
Hello, and thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, in the shocks you were mentioning, what about AI and the impact it may have on inequalities?
Well, it's difficult. I really don't have a particular view. I think actually the AI shock, like what many people believe, would be translated into the increase in the capital share of national income. An increase of capital share in national income implies an increase in inequality, because as we know, capital income is much more unequally distributed than labor income. That in turn would actually tend to push inequalities within countries up. But, you know, the main story in this whole thing, when you take globally, is not really so much what happens to inequality within countries. The main story is what happens to growth rates of poor countries, populous countries versus rich countries. So if the AI makes growth in India or in Africa faster than growth in what I call the political West, then AI would reduce global inequality. But if the opposite happens, then obviously inequality would go up. So what I want to say, as soon as you speak of global inequality, you have to go beyond the effect of what AI might produce in individual country. The effect really, which is crucial, is AI going to accelerate growth of poor countries or not? And I do not have some great theory there. I do believe that it might become, on balance, perhaps advantageous to Africa, to the extent that they will be able to jump several generations ahead technologically, and to the fact that they have lots of young people who seem to be better with new technologies than the old people. But that's it's a guess.
Thanks, Branko, for this great talk. I'm going to ask you to speculate on something that may be unimportant, but maybe not, which is, what's the impact of migration flows on global inequality? Because people, may be at some place in the origin country, but then they may be placed in a different portion in the distribution. I don't know if that can be measured at all. If you've tried, but if you haven't, if you care to speculate.
No, I have not, actually, because of course the numbers that I get are, as you know, household survey numbers, and in principle, household surveys should, as you know, report or survey the present population in a given country, regardless of whether they are legally or illegally, whether they are migrants or not. So I cannot really disentangle that at all. But in principle, migration should help, of course, reduction in global inequality and reduction in global poverty. So I don't think that we have analytically much trouble by saying that migration is inequality reducing, simply because it would actually reduce the gaps between mean country incomes, most likely, and it would reduce gaps, of course, between individuals. But this is theoretical statement. You know, people have, I think a long time ago, I think Len Pritchard did some modeling work on how much it would reduce global inequality. You know, the numbers are not staggering. We're talking about 3 to 4% of the people who live in countries where they were not born. So migration is not really, I mean, in these numbers as large as it is in the public perception or discourse. But let me just say one more thing on that. But what is striking is when you compare income distributions of rich countries with poor countries in Africa, is that very often the top of the African countries' income distributions ends before the bottom of European countries' income distribution begins. So in other words, the top 5% people in Mali are in PPP terms less well off than the bottom 5% in Sweden. So technically you cannot have a migration that would not reduce inequality. First, income would go up and inequality would go down. So that's a striking part, that when you have some distributions that are entirely non-overlapping.
Branko, how much of your results are, and also your suggestions of what may happen in the future, depends on the number of individuals in each country?
But depends on what?
On the number of individuals, on the populations of the countries.
Yes. Well, it does depend, of course, quite a lot. I have not done, I mean, obviously that's quite doable. You can actually do take population projections, which are reasonably good. But of course, you have to make assumptions about what will happen to growth rates in the countries and what would happen to income distributions in the countries. I did one thing which I thought was interesting, and it was the following. I asked the following question: when would China catch up with the US? And the question is actually, how do you define that? If you define as a total GDP, China has overtaken the US in PPP terms. If you define it as GDP in exchange rates, China is about still 30% below the US as a total. If you define it on per capita basis, China is 1/3 of the US. But I did the following thing, because with income data, that I have, you can do that. I said, when will the number of the rich Chinese come to be the same number in absolute amounts as the number of rich Americans? And I define it, everybody in America above the median. So that's currently 160, 70 million people. And currently China has 40 million people who are above that level. But when you run the growth rate over the 20 years and make 2% point differential between Chinese growth rate and the American growth rate, within 20%, the number of Chinese who are, by this definition, affluent, it becomes the same as the number of affluent Americans, simply because Chinese population is much larger. And that could be one way to do that. But then if you let the growth rate differential be 3 percentage points, then that becomes a shorter period. And I think to some extent that the current trade war between the US and China is explained precisely by that. And there are studies by Chinese institutes that show that actually the effect on China would be more negative than the effect on the US. But I think the US follows the policy of loss-loss. So they lose, and China loses. But if they lose less than China loses, then the catch-up is being postponed. Each 0.5% difference postpones the catch-up by, I think, 7 years. So if they count, okay, we would lose, but we will make China lose even more, it's a winning proposition for, I think, the US.
Many thanks, Branko. Super interesting, as always. Just on that point you just made, it'd be very interesting also to ask the question, at what point will China embed an entire US distribution, not just like the top half? But
at what point China, sorry, say it again.
At what point China will embed an entire US distribution? That would be a super interesting turning point. And second thing I wanted to ask was, you mentioned that India has stopped or is about to stop playing an equalizing role, and I was puzzled by that because...
No, India is not, sorry, I misspoke. India has an equalizing role.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Sorry, I really misspoke there. Obviously, China has lost equalizing role, but that made the role of India even more important because it is the new engine. And that engine, if that engine works, it would really contribute significantly to the reduction of global inequality. So let's be clear on that because India has not lost this role. India does have this role. On China, China is, well, unfortunately, I don't have this slide here, but when you put Chinese-American distribution, there is now an overlap, as I was mentioning before. You have 40 million Chinese people who are actually above the US median income. So the overlap exists. It is small, but it does exist. But when you, going back to the Conchita's question, when you let the model, so to speak, run, because China is much bigger, that overlap sort of becomes bigger and bigger size-wise, although the differences are still fairly large, particularly when they are large in household survey data. As you know, Chinese investments are very high, Chinese consumption is low, and Chinese sort of incomes reflect that. So in other words, Chinese incomes from household service in comparison to US income from household service are lower than Chinese GDP per capita versus the American per capita. But when you run it, 20 to 30 years, you have very different situation compared to today if you assume about 2% gap in growth rates, which I don't think is unreasonable because the gaps in the last 40 years, if you take each decade, the gaps were between 4 and 8%.
Thanks, Branko. You ended on the positive note in terms of decreasing the national inequalities in LAC. But do you have any reflection on what is behind that? For example, Raimundo has a paper, I think, on the effect on minimum income on poverty in Mexico, or other policies that you can reflect on. Thanks.
No, I really don't, because for that I totally rely on what people have written on individual countries. Brazil, obviously Brazil, Mexico, largest countries, and Argentina, Uruguay, and so forth, Chile. But I totally rely on what people have written. And as I mentioned before, as you know much better than I, there is this debate whether really Latin American inequality individually in countries has gone as much as the surveys tell us. But I think when I showed you this 9% differential, my sort of guess is that even if you were to adjust for that for individual countries, take Brazil or Mexico, you would still end up with not 9% decline, maybe the 7 or 6% decline. But I think the decline would be still there.
Just to follow up on that question, Branko, thanks for the presentation. So you talk about Latin American, the high within countries inequality. So following up, the question is, if I wanted to take something to each country in Latin America as a suggestion and what to do or what not to do you have any reflection on, because if I might be completely wrong, just it seems that Kuznets was right somewhat on your studies, because maybe he just missed which inequality we need to talk about it. So back to the question is that if we want to see lower inequalities, persistent decrease in inequalities in Latin America, what is the takeaway point from what you show here to us, Latin Americans, to bring home to our governments? What can we learn from that?
No, well, the takeaway point is actually what I'm going to learn today from your presentations. Because here we were really doing with the effects, on growth rates, on distributions, from either policies or education increases or declines or whatever, all population growth rates. So there is no really takeaway point on policy which one can actually do after the presentation like this. It's really the policies are the input that I simply observe here, but I cannot really say anything more. So that's why I'm actually going to stay here for the whole day.
More questions? Okay.
You said the reduction in global inequality as a good thing, right? In the last decades. And now we don't know what's going to happen, but maybe it will continue. But at the same time, within countries, inequality is arising. So can we celebrate this fact? Isn't it a paradox that...
which inequality is increasing within country?
No, about within country inequalities are rising in most countries, like the developed countries. So isn't it a paradox that we celebrate the reduction in global inequality, but in the individual countries, the inequality is arising?
This is what I said, actually. That's the feature of the third era that I was describing. The feature there is that between country inequality, population weighted, that's crucial part. You have to do it population weighted, because we are talking about individuals here, is on the decline and has entirely transformed the world and reshuffled incomes. On the other hand, within individual countries, if you compare today, let's suppose with 1980 or 85 or 1990, inequality in most large countries, take China, inequality is now double in terms of the Gini coefficient compared to what it was. You take India, it is much higher. I think Indian income inequality is over 50 now, and I actually believe income inequality in India more than consumption inequality. And actually I used India income in global income distribution when it became available. So yes, it's actually paradoxical that we have at the same time, not paradoxical, but it's specific to this era that we have rising inequality within countries and the declining global inequality. If you were an extreme right-wing guy, you would say, well, that's what increase in within country inequality gave us, because it accelerated growth of countries like China and India and made it possible for them to become richer and made it possible for global inequality to go down. That's a narrative that one can make. I'm not agreeing fully with that, but it's a doable narrative. If you believe that increasing inequality in India and China was a cause or was concomitant with high growth rates.
More questions? Okay, please.
So, following on several questions that have been asked, and going back to a concept that you talked about before, the idea of the homoplutia, how would we consider the global homoplutia to be changing across these three areas? Like, the current era means that we have now a top class, a global class that it's both rich in labor income and capital income, or it's mostly capital income. So what will be like the description of the homoplutia through these three areas?
Well, that's an excellent question, because really, and I think to a large extent you're right, actually, it is doable not for 2 centuries, but certainly for the last 40 years. Behind that, obviously, there is a functional income distribution. There is the distribution between capital and labor. What you alluded to by homoplutia was the fact that in rich countries, the US again is a very good example, there is an increasing percentage of people at the very top who are also in the top decile by labor income and capital income. And this is a feature of new capitalism which did not exist before. And what is interesting, I actually had the data from LIS actually for Latin American countries and for the US. What is interesting is when you look at what percentage of people in the top 10% of Mexico are in the top percent by labor income and in the top 10% by capital income. So you have to be rich capitalist and rich worker. The percentage for Mexico and Brazil is below 10%. It's about between 7 and 8%. So only 1/10 of the people who are in the top decile are homoplutic in the sense they are rich capitalists or they have high capital income and they have high labor income. In the US, it's almost 1/3. And that, in my opinion, creates an entirely different dynamic where you have a top class which is really now combining both incomes from capital and labor. This is no longer the old-fashioned capitalists at the top and they have only capital income. And actually Mexico is still like that in the sense that people with who are rich in terms of capital are not necessarily going to go to study and work as laborers in order to get high income. And I think that really creates a new elite. That's part of my new book, and it was also mentioned in Capitalism Alone, as you know. I think it creates a new elite, which is very difficult to dislodge because they are really rich in both factors of production. It reduces the gap between capital and labor, but only for that really top. And I think introduces the whole concept of meritocracy, transmission of power through inheritance, transmission of best education through ability to place children in such schools. And I think the concept of the elite comes, in my opinion, should come much more now when we have that particular elite which is rich in capital and labor. But as I said, I think it really applies to only the very rich countries. The numbers are very similar, for example, for Western Europe, Italy, Germany, we're talking about 20 to 25% of these people. And then when you look to Latin America, we talk about much lower number, simply because rich capitalists generally do not have very, very high labor incomes. Or maybe some of them have zero labor income, because if you're rich capitalist, why do you need to work?
Branko, let me ask the last question.
Yes.
So, and what do you expect to happen with inequality with President Trump, particularly in the region? I mean, we expect maybe more capital income is treated more favorably, likely.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
For the region and in Mexico, we expect, migration issues, trade tensions. So what do you expect?
You know, this is not an original point. I do expect actually inequality in the US to go up. You know, inequality in the US in the last 15 years has been more or less stable. So if you look at the Gini coefficient, it has been about 41, 42, 40. If you want to make your liberal friends, as I do in US, angry, you can tell them that the largest decline in US inequality happened in the last year of the first Trump administration. Which of course was done by Congress with large CARES Act. And you see that actually, that was quite extraordinary. 2020 is really extraordinary. I'm actually surprised that so far I have not seen many people writing about that. US market income inequality because of COVID went up by 1.5 Gini point. But because of huge transfers that really were totally pro-poor, when you look at them, but went very deep into distribution, you had disposable market income which went down by 1.5 Gini point. So you have the government action. That's actually what the power of government in rich countries is. The government action reduced Gini by 3 points. US Gini is 41. So the government action in that 1 year reduced 8% of US inequality. This is quite extraordinary as what happened then. But of course in 2021, things went back towards the old level, and in 22, they're back to 2019. So obviously it was one shot. But I think for Trump, I believe, as you were saying, actually, I think most people believe that pro-capital legislation and probably reduction of the top marginal rates and so on would actually make inequality higher. Now, what would migration do? I don't know, but I think the entire policy framework of the new administration would be to increase inequality in a belief that actually that would be good for the economy, it would actually make America grow faster. And as you know, America is now growing quite fast compared to the other rich countries. So it could happen. On the other hand, they would have to have something with tariff rates, hoping that that would actually keep some jobs. You have the industrial policy started by Biden. So there are many contradictory elements. But I would, if I were to bet whether it would go up or down, I would bet it would go up.
Well, thank you very much, Branko.
Thank you.
Okay. So, three announcements. So, just the Sala Josefina Zoraida is just in the 5th floor. You just go straight and go take the stairs or the elevator, and then the 5th floor. Then the lunch is behind the classrooms, number 2247. So, if you go through the library, go for the classrooms, just behind that. And the third and the most important one is that we need to leave this room because we need to put a barrier here. So this is Sala Alfonso Reyes letter A, and on this side is letter B. So we need to move so they can put here the barrier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. How long did it take? I've developed